For more discussion about that dispute and border tension in Beijing, we have two panelists joining us here. Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Also with us, Professor Wang Yiwei, stay with us from Renmin University. Joining us in New Delhi in India, we have Professor Madham Lalapat, who is Director of the Geopolitics and International Relations Department at Manipur University. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you to our program. First of all, is there a way to resolve what is now a border tension and likely, if go on like this, a crisis? Let's have Professor Nalapat first from the Indian side.
Well, I'd like to point out that the entire border between India and China should be mutually agreed and delineated. And certainly, India would very much like to see this happen. Now, we have had situations in which we have said that Chinese troops have been crossing into Indian territory. In fact, some 300 such incidents take place on average every year. So all this is a consequence of the fact that we don't really have a sharply defined border. And of course, we've been talking about Nehru. Nehru sent many letters to Mr. Zhou Enlai, and in several of those letters, he claimed a large part of territories which are today regarded by China as Chinese territory. So I think, frankly, Nehru sent a lot of letters, and if we have to accept one letter, then it's difficult to understand why another letter is not accepted. My point is very simple. These are two big mature countries. They need to sit down and work out a mutually acceptable border. After all these decades, it's very surprising this has not happened.
Okay. Mr. Yang, you want to respond to your Indian counterpart's view?
Well, I'm afraid that I totally disagree with our Indian friends' argument, because the legal documents between countries, especially based on the convention signed by Chinese government and the British government more than 100 years ago, should be the legal base for all the border solution or settlement. While if you say some letter could be legal, some useful, some letters or documents are not useful, that will make the international order norms in chaos, especially in China-Indian disputes on the boundary.
I'm not sure whether any one of you have read through all of the letters through both sides. So before we make a statement about exactly what all of those letters were about, we probably need to go a little bit more about the specific framework. That is exactly my question. Professor Wang, is there a way for the two sides to come out of this crisis or border tension?
Definitely, both sides, I think, would like to make this tension be continued, because I think September, the Xiamen summit, BRICS summit, and particularly India just joined SCO. So it's a test for the new members, what kind of behaviors you are according not just international law, but also SCO principles to peacefully to solve your dispute with your neighbor. India actually, to be frankly, the problem, of course, you cannot just blame either side. It's because of the British colonist period, and the Indians consider it is the successor of all the India subcontinental and the Indian Ocean. This makes the Pakistan and even Nepal and other India's neighborhoods complain about that. So India has territory dispute with nearly with all the neighbors, not just with China. So that's a big burden of the British colonist period. But so far, I think the Indian side should recognize that today's world is not the success of the colonialist period.
I see. Before we go to that part of the regional issue, let's keep on focusing on this specific one. Professor Nalapat, it is no secret that China and India have been working on the border discussions and negotiations for decades. There are high times and there are low times. There are successful times, there are disappointing times. So the two sides have to, in a way, over the process of time, come to certain kinds of unspoken consensus. That is to let the discussion go on while at the same time try to observe the bottom line of one another, and not to destroy or try to, in a way, blur some of the already mutually agreed or mutually abide by principles, or at least a consensus. So will this specific event be just one of those hiccups? Or will this specific event really sour the whole relationship, which is not sensible, I guess, for both sides to do? Professor?
No, I fully agree it's not sensible for India or China to have a bad relationship, but I simply want to point out that this particular piece of territory has a different significance to India than it does to China. India is a friendly country, so there's hopefully no question of any kind of a war between India and China. Now this territory, from the Indian side, if any military controls this territory, it can very easily break what India calls the chicken's neck. That's a very narrow area of land which links the entire northeast of India to the rest of India. It can create a situation in which Sikkim is threatened, and of course Bhutan is under very heavy pressure. From the Indian point of view, militarily, this is a very important piece of land.
Right.
So it is from that context, very frankly, that I believe that India is taking the stand. From the Chinese point of view, I don't believe militarily this is as important as some of the areas in the west and some of the areas in the east, because after all, this is a friendly neighbor, and frankly, after that unfortunate situation in '62, we have lived in complete peace. From our side, this territory is important because through that territory, the chicken's neck can be cut in a matter of 24 hours.
I see. Well, understanding the concern of the other side is the very start of having any dialogue and any discussion. That is exactly what we're doing right here. So, Professor Wang, after learning what Professor Nalapat has argued, what do you make of the reasoning of Professor Nalapat's words?
Firstly, India is very sensitive to China and its neighbors. We should understand about that psychology. But, importance is another thing. Principles, law is another thing. You cannot say that because it's the chicken of net, and then so we can do something and violate the principles and change the status quo. Even Indians make the Bhutan as Sikkim, and Sikkim be part of the India. So China didn't recognize as the territory of India. And then now, even in Nepal, they also want to make Nepal to another Bhutan, and then Bhutan to Sikkim. So make our territory more situations more worse and worse. So that kind of situation, I think we should change. Particularly the Indian psychology, mentality, I think should change in this regard.
So if I could just conclude what you just earlier said, are you suggesting, Professor Wang, that India has to realize to a certain extent that its neighbors, such as Bhutan, such as Nepal, should have their own freedom to establish, maintain, and have the nature of its relationship with its neighbors, for example, with China, rather than India having an impact on these countries in terms of the nature of the relationship that these countries will have and could have with China. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because of the 1962, the border conflicts, the memory is a burden of the India. So India very worried about China will take the opportunities of the high ground and then invade India. So they kick the chicken of the net. But I don't think this is Chinese behavior or Chinese intention. So I don't think the India will worry about it so much, too sensitive to that geography of the importance.
So Professor Nalapat, what about that argument? I mean, on the one hand, there is sensitivity for any culture, any country. But on the other hand, if a territory belongs to a country, it belongs to a country. And then if another country sends troops to an area that belongs to another country, there seems to be some violation of principles, as we earlier argued. Professor Nalapat, is that oversensitivity for India? And how will India deal with its relationship with the neighbors, particularly vis-a-vis there is a China that is in India's neighborhood as well? while China also sees India as a big partner in the neighborhood too?
Well, I'd like to point out India has been a very good neighbor to China. For example, the Chinese trade surplus with India is some $50 billion. I mean, you were discussing Huawei in the last segment. Huawei, Xiaomi, and Chinese telecom companies are almost taking control of the Indian market. Day after tomorrow, if not tomorrow, Chinese infrastructure companies, Chinese electricity companies will also play a very dominant role in the India market because of their quality and because of price advantages. So there is a lot to gain from good relations with India so far as China is concerned, and of course geopolitically so far as India is concerned. So my point is very simple. These things happen. There have been cases, for example, our state of Uttarakhand, we have seen Chinese troops come in, and there have been some problems. Now these things happen. I don't think we should blow this up into almost like a warlike situation or a cause of war. I think we must understand these are local events and they should be dealt with locally, and in my view they should not be blown out of proportion.
Okay.
The overall relationship between India and China is too important for us to allow these small events to be blown out of proportion.
Okay. Professor Nalapad emphasized on the word local, even though I do not know necessarily the interpretation of local. I only understand regional in that regard because we're talking about different countries together. Professor Yang, on the other hand, how should China see the latest situation? What are the measured and yet important attitude China should have toward what is going on right now?
Well,
and if I could, just related to Professor Nalapad's words, China and India are important partners.
Yep.
Chinese business people there in India seem to have an advantage, not because India giving preferential policies to Chinese businesses, but rather to their competitive edge. Having said that, though, still the two countries benefit from one another. And they should be, and they have to be, talking about regional. So, Mr. Yang, what should be the measured and the right approach from China? Let's just say from today on.
Well, first of all, I think the latest incident, on the incident listed, we need to clarify two fundamental questions. Number one, is Indian troops is in Chinese side or Chinese troops in the Indian side?
You mean the territories?
Yeah, territory. And the fact is, it is Indian troops in Chinese side. And secondly, China was shocked. Chinese people, Chinese government was shocked by the incident because that is the first time for such a case, because that is the uncontroversial area. There are indeed several pieces of the territory disputed, but that area has never been disputed.
Over the past few decades.
This is the first time.
So India, that is what China is nervous about.
Yeah, nervous and shocked. And China's logic is controversial areas that was belong to India. And this case indicated uncontroversial period also belong to India if India feels that's important. So that will open a very bad example for the bilateral relation. So for China, we believe, first thing first, let's return to the convention signed by Chinese and the British government. And number two, return to the situation before the latest incidents. Then we can discuss what is India's concerns or what is China's interest.
But it's interesting when you say this because principles are principles. If territories are territories, if every time when there is violations of territories, you go back to the negotiation table and talk about the principle once again, that seems to be not the principles that we're talking about here, Mr. Yang. What exactly are you suggesting here?
Well, I think we need to return to the legal arrangement. This area has been set by a mutually accepted legal arrangement. Okay. That's the fact. So return to the facts, and then we can discuss all issues through the table, rather than touch this issue by two militaries.
All right. Before we go, Professor Wang, there are so many things related to this. For example, this thing happened when the Prime Minister of India just visited the United States And this also happened not far from the G20 summit. This also happened just a few months before the BRICS summit. This also happened right after India got the membership of the SCO. So a lot of a coincidence seem to be over there. I'm not trying to suggest anything. I'm just saying under these big circumstances, how should China and India approach each other from now on this issue and many others? Professor Wang, I only leave you with 30 seconds if you can. This is a huge topic, but Professor Wang, please help me.
I think India is an independent country. We do not trust that India will be used by the United States to want to do something contain China or make trouble for China's territory. So we hope our friendship will continue not to be impacted by this incident. So India will return of that.
We hope that will be the case. For now, I want to thank the three of you, both from China and India, Madhav Nalapat, Wang Yiwei, Yang Xiyu. Thank you so much, gentlemen.